Welcome everyone to another edition of MPSE Presents Designing the Game Cinematic. My name is Eric Marks. I'm joined today by the one and only Ludvig Forssell. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
And we'll be discussing the game cinematics from Metal Gear Solid V Ground Zeroes. Gamers were introduced to legendary game director Hideo Kojima, as well as stealth action games in general, way back in 1987 with the release of the first Metal Gear. Games sure have changed a lot over the past 37 years, perhaps most dramatically with the evolution of game cinematics and their impact on narrative storytelling. Kojima and his team set an incredibly high bar for this in 1998 with Metal Gear Solid, and they have continued to be at the forefront of the medium ever since. You could argue that they are in fact the godfathers of modern game cinematics as we know them. Today, we take believable storytelling, cinematic experiences, evocative music, and top-tier voice acting and sound design in games for granted. None of this would be possible without the innovations of Hideo Kojima and his team as they continue to up the ante with each Metal Gear title over the years. In 2014, one of those giant technological leaps was with Metal Gear Solid V Ground Zeroes. The level of visual and audio details in the game were staggering, as well as the camera work and guiding hand of the cinematics, leaving players wondering how on earth they pulled it off. Well, today we have the rare treat of learning about it all from MGS Ground Zeroes composer and longtime Kojima Productions audio director, Ludvig Forssell.
Let's do this. It's going to be fun dipping into some of that stuff from Metal Gear. It's been a minute, so I hope I can remember most of the details, but looking forward to talking to you about this.
Yeah, absolutely. Same here. So without further ado, let's play through this cinematic from the game from the beginning. We'll play it through all the way once, and then we'll start talking, and then we can play and pause after that. But let's play through the cinematic.
Sounds good.
She told us everything. Don't worry, I kept my word. She didn't suffer long. Here. You earned it. How's it feel to play the traitor? No more war games. You're a real man now, soldier. Give my regards to your boss when you get home.
10 days ago, we got reports that Paz was still alive.
She survived.
She was rescued by a Belizean fisherman who found her drifting in the Caribbean.
So what's the plan? Silence her before we're compromised?
No. I've got something else in mind. Our friends at Cypher suspect Paz could be a double agent. She's being held for interrogation at a camp on the southern tip of Cuba.
Black site. Nice. A slice of American pie on communist soil, and out of U.S. legal jurisdiction.
The upcoming inspection of Mother Base has to be connected somehow. The timing's too perfect.
The UN's nuclear inspection.
My guess is they're trying to corroborate Paz's leak.
We're an army without a nation.
Word of our capabilities gets out, and we'll have the whole world out to shut us down. Having an American private intelligence agency involved's bad news. Cypher's the ones who sent Paz to us in the first place.
She knows their true nature.
Right. Paz is our only link to Cypher. If she's still alive, we need her on our side.
Trojan horse is in! This pirate crackdown's a go! Move!
So who's the other target?
That would be Chico. He's being held in the same area as Paz. Last radio contact was 40 hours ago. Find them both. Bring him back alive. Enter the compound from the south cliff. Secure Chico and Paz, then report back from the rendezvous point. We'll send a chopper from across the Cuban border. You should be back at Mother Base in time for lunch. You'll probably just miss our guests. The only catch is you go in solo. The politically sensitive nature of the mission means backup is not an option.
Fine. I like some alone time now and then. I'm in front of the prison camp.
Excellent, Snake. Age hasn't slowed you down one bit.
Kept you waiting, huh?
and Paz are being held in an old unused part of the compound. Get inside and head northeast.
All right. Good stop there. Ludvig, so many questions. This is just such an incredible piece. I mean, it's long, it's beautiful, tells such a story. It's, for those who didn't notice, the camera never cuts, which is such an impressive feat too. How much time do you get to work on a cinematic sequence like this?
Wow. Well, this is sort of a special one for me, because this was really my first job at Kojima Productions after joining, was doing this originally trailer for the 25th anniversary of Metal Gear. So that came out way before the game actually did, and for that first trailer we only did the Japanese voiceover, so that's what people first saw. And I guess in a way it was also sort of the lead composer Honda-san, Akihiro Honda, whose name we saw in the credits here, sort of testing me out for the gig. So I think for something like this, we spent more time than maybe you'd usually spend. But yeah, it was weeks and weeks of trying things out, finally playing it back to Hideo and him picking out things that he liked and wanted us to bring out more, like the famous stinger dad thing, for example, he loved. So that was sort of a thing that we leaned in more and more as we sort of worked on this thing. And I guess I came along, started working on this when it was pretty close to final cut already. I only joined Kojima Productions in, what was it? I think must have been January in 2012 or so. So they'd already been doing motion capture and working on prototyping the game and this presentation as well for a while. Again, I can't say for sure exactly how long it took, but there was a lot of back and forth, especially with it sort of being my first thing that would be presented to the world and for the entire project itself. So we wanted to make sure that we got it right first time around.
Another question just before we start playing back again. How did Akihiro Honda find you and recruit you to be part of this team? Like, what was that process like for you?
So I joined Konami firstly out of college in Japan in 2011, and I was on a different team, and then some restructuring within the company was happening, and I'd already been sort of friends with Honda-san, and he knew what kind of music I was making for the other projects that I'd been on at Konami, and he also knew that I wanted to work more in cinematic type of gameplay, and basically the best fit for me within the company of Konami would be Kojima Productions, and he was aware of that, and he brought me on during that whole restructure process because they were building up the team over at Kojima Productions.
Incredible. Okay, we're gonna start playing back the video. We'll kind of start and stop and talk about certain things as we go, and we can cover a variety of topics here, but let's play back. So I noticed during, there's like the opening sort of composed music, there's composed music towards the end with the theme you'd mentioned, and then there's obviously the Here's to You in the middle. Was there temp music? Like, was there something cued in there before you started to kind of give you a guide to what was needed?
Yeah, I believe that at least for the biggest final climb sequence, Honda-san had already put in some score from, I can't remember what it was, but it was basically the idea of having a repeating stinger was already in there. So we kind of wanted to do that from the get-go. For the first bit, I'm not sure exactly. I think I just wanted to try something out. That's why for this whole first sequence, I'm doing something very, very ambient, just sort of underscoring, creating a mood, not getting in the way of throwing too many emotions in there prior to Here's to You coming in. But I do remember that final sequence having some temp score that sort of gave me some direction as to where to go with it.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's stop the video there. So I also noticed there are, several moments in this where almost like a J.J. Abrams style lens flare will kind of go full bloom in the camera. And then we hear this sort of like stinger that in the film and TV world, I mean, that could be music, that could be sound effects, that could be different departments. Like, how did you all approach moments like that?
So that's all on the sound design side. I think it's a fun thing to talk about, though, because that was a huge conceptual thing, as you see right now in the shot where we're stopping, like the lens flares. Not sure if it was necessarily only J.J. Abrams that they were looking at, but that's definitely a trait that he's known for. But that sound effect, the swang sounds, sort of became a through line throughout all of this game, and then the Phantom Pain afterwards, with them adding that sound effect to things like coming outside from a dark room, like the blinding light sort of thing. So it definitely was a conceptual thing throughout the whole story of Metal Gear Solid 5, this one and Phantom Pain.
Okay. All right, we can keep playing. So I also want to ask you a few questions about sound too, because I know you started as composer on these games, and then later with Kojima Productions, you became an audio director and oversaw a lot more than just music. So you kind of have a sense of Kojima's style for sound design, for cinematic sound, things like that.
It's actually a funny story as we're watching this trailer. This trailer obviously first came out during the 25th anniversary, and the Japanese only version. They did record English temp voice for this prior to that, and I thought it was terrible, and that's when I sort of first spoke up about things outside of music, and that kind of snowballed into me then doing helping out with the voiceover work on MGS5, and I guess in a way also how I later became the audio director at Kojima Productions.
Wow. Let's stop the video there. I also want to ask about, very interesting, very dynamic sort of cinematic choices in terms of the mix of this. And I know you didn't yourself mix this video, these cinematics in this game per se, but so like we have that moment where the ambient sound effects, backgrounds, everything kind of cuts out right before he clicks the cassette player. How early are moments like that kind of chosen by Kojima and team, and like how do you kind of discover the preferences and how you're going to approach a mix like that?
So obviously I can't speak for this one. I wasn't in the final mix, and I do think it was a pretty early choice, especially when it comes to Here's to You, since that was sort of Kojima's main idea for the music of this entire scene. He wanted this bit to play here, and for trailers and other choices where Mr. Kojima likes to use licensed music, he likes to drown out all of the ambient sound and just have music playing for at least a bit of it. And rewatching this now, it's been a while, I'm rediscovering some of these choices, and I definitely feel like I like to do the same kind of stuff in my own audio mixing. But you have the helicopter flying overhead, bringing back ambient sound sort of as a cue, and you see that throughout the whole video. Whenever there's a big choice in the mix state changes, there's always sort of a cue leading you in or out of those, and that's something that I usually try to, especially for the years I was audio director and composer at Kojima Productions, I tried to think of that while scoring the music, because I did have the pull to be able to make those choices on my own. Usually as the composer, you kind of have to do a back and forth and work with the sound designers to make these choices. But I sort of had the opportunity to creatively come up with these ideas at an early stage and then present rough mixes of that to Mr. Kojima. And sometimes he'd be like, well, let's actually, when I'd gone halfway on something, he'd be like, let's remove everything just for when the character lands after it jumps down from the helicopter, stuff like that. So those kinds of pretty hard cuts in the audio mix is something I like to do, and I think Mr. Kojima is also somebody who likes to lean into that kind of stuff.
It's wonderful. All right, let's keep playing. I think another way to explain it too is like there's this harsh subjectivity. You know, like we can be looking through one character's eyes, or we're kind of experiencing this as a subjective experience. Like, how often is that kind of topic brought up with Mr. Kojima as you're working on a cinematic?
It really depends on the story that you're trying to tell. I think you take something like Death Stranding, where I was the audio director, it's sort of a completely different perspective than what you have here in Metal Gear, especially Ground Zeroes, when you're jumping back into the shoes of Naked Snake, who's been with the franchise for multiple titles, and is, you know, he doesn't have to say a lot to speak for who he is or what he does. So again, I feel like I'd be sort of out of my depth to speak for the choices that were made concerning that for this particular video, just because at the time I just jumped on it at the tail end and wrote the music for it. But yeah, could you give me a specific example? I might be able to give you some more on that.
Ooh, subjectivity. I mean,
Yeah.
in this one, I mean, to me, it's mostly the mixing, and I mean, the camera is kind of is telling a story too, because we're floating between different characters' perspectives, it seems, and you know, very deliberate decisions on what's revealed, what's hidden, how much we know, and when things are revealed, and what where we're hearing things from. So, you know, another subjective moment is obviously it comes later when the XOF patches are, you know, falling down, and suddenly we slow down into slow motion. Everything kind of changes, goes into slow motion.
Right.
Sound shifts,
Right.
and then, you know, music and everything slams in once we see Snake. Like, that would be a very subjective moment to me.
Yeah, I think that's like very much, you know, the beauty of this scene in particular, with it being in one cut and you're going between these different perspectives. It throughout the entirety of Metal Gear Solid 5, there was an artistic choice of just having as few cuts as possible, and I think that you sort of have to lean into that, the choice of perspective on the audio mix side, to make those changes in perspective make sense. And yeah, you're obviously not supposed to know what's going on in this one. It's definitely a teaser of like, what year is this? Why is Chico and Paz in these cages? And you know, this whole game was supposed to be a teaser for the main game of the Phantom Pain. So definitely, Mr. Kojima wanted to lean into the whole mystery of, you know, showing off this obvious villain character, but like just saying, oh, he's the commander of the XOF. You don't know the XOF? Well, I guess you're about to find out in like a couple of years or something. So there's that like presenting people and characters without actually telling you anything that you actually want to know. So I think that's really cool, the way that it's done here, and how, again, since I wasn't part of the mix, I can't speak for the exact choices, why they were made, but it really comes through in the way I guess Mr. Kojima envisioned from the beginning.
Absolutely. Let's back up this video about 5 seconds and then hit play. There's a really interesting subjective moment here, I think, where, you know, where they scan the side of the helicopter, and then again, the sound effect of the scan cuts out the music abruptly, which I just love these sorts of bold choices that aren't very common, I don't think, in game cinematics, and even some of the bold choices you don't always see in long-form narrative or episodic or films. Like, I think this is so creative and inventive, and it's amazing to hear how these come together like this. Yeah, let's pause it there. So, yeah, that to me is another example of the subjectivity that I think you all created, which is so it calls a lot of attention to itself in a really beautiful artistic way.
Yeah, it's sort of supposed, I guess, to like slap you in the face and be like, nope, no, now we're doing this. You're not supposed to be lulled into this sense of, I don't know if safety is the right word, but like the music is sort of, creating a rhythm, and that just kills that rhythm. And it's supposed, again, to be like sort of a smack in the face of change is happening, obviously.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, let's keep playing. I wanted to ask you too about, so you're the composer. How often and what are your interactions like with the audio director of the game, who I believe his name is Kazuki Muraoka, who was the audio director, I believe, on all the MGS games up to this point, from 1998 through this game.
Yeah, so I would firstly be working with Honda-san and preparing stuff to present to Muraoka-san, who then, be working directly with Mr. Kojima. It was not until like after I think we finished work on this game that I started working directly with Mr. Kojima as well, as Muraoka-san. But basically, as I said, as this was sort of my first gig within the company, I was definitely being, my stuff was being overwatched and curated by Honda-san prior to working with Muraoka-san. So basically, by the time I presented anything to Muraoka-san, he was like, this is pretty good. Let's maybe change the thing here or there. But Muraoka-san also, as you might know, wrote music for the early Metal Gear games, so he's also a composer himself, so he would always have feedback on music in a musical way, rather than just talking about overseeing the whole audio experience.
You're working on this game. You said this is sort of your proving ground, like this specific cinematic and trailer. Let's stop the video there. So as you were sort of like building this trust and relationship and working initially, like, did you find there were anything that was particularly surprising or the most challenging things for you as you were sort of like building trust with them and learning about their preferences for music and sound?
I'll be honest with you, there's a lot I don't remember about those days, or the early days of everything. It's been 10 years plus now, but what I do remember, again, is showing off the first version of this and Mr. Kojima really liking that one stinger that comes out right after the scene that we're looking at. And I think that really just gave me a real big boost in the relationship of trust there, with having created something that he could grab onto, that wasn't just it's good music or whatever. But it's like a clear conceptual thing that is easy to remember. So I think that was, to me, like, I must have been super nervous at the time, knowing that, they're gonna go watch it now, and then I'll be hearing some feedback through proxy or something. But like, that was literally the first time I talked directly with Mr. Kojima, I think, when he came and said, like, that thing is cool, do more of that, sort of.
Amazing. I also wanted to ask you too about the sort of language barrier. Like, do you speak Japanese, or did you have to learn that in order to take on this role, or what was that like working with Muraoka-san and Kojima and Akira Honda and team?
Yeah, so Kojima Productions is 100% Japanese. There were some other foreigners there, so you'd have the occasional moment of English. But I came to Japan right after finishing high school, and I'd already been here for 4 or 5 years by the time I joined Konami. So I was already fluent in Japanese. I'd gone to Japanese school before going to college over here. So the language barrier was never really a thing, but obviously it's gotten better and better over the years. I think at the very early stages, obviously, I maybe wasn't as used to Kojima-san's Kansai version of Japanese, for example. He also speaks very quickly, stuff like that. But no, not really a language barrier to speak of.
That's great. Okay, let's keep playing the video. I also wanted to ask, so this was the first big reveal. Obviously, you mentioned it was a trailer first for the public, and then And then you get the full game, and you get other cinematics that are maybe less high pressure environments, or you're already building trust, and they're being worked on all concurrently or for the full production. What sort of states do you get other cinematics in? Like how early on in terms of visuals, or the locked cuts versus rough cuts and things like that? Or are you sometimes getting the other cinematics for a game like this?
I think for Metal Gear, we were working completely off of picture-locked video, meaning that if any changes were made, they really wouldn't impact the music that much. Just the fact that this game was made over the course of 6 or 7 years, I think, from prior to me joining the company, a lot of the groundwork had been done, and a lot of the time that was being spent was just refining a lot of the stuff. So in general, as far as I can remember, there were visual upgrades, but generally I was working off of pretty much what you'd be expecting as a film composer to be working off of for a film.
Mm-hmm. Let's pause it there. This is just such an iconic, amazing moment. I mean, like for a fan to watch the trailer and kind of feel the music rise, everything kind of lead up to this camera move and what you all built. I just think it's so incredibly done. This is the theme you were talking about that Kojima and company liked, that you were building and building and building towards this moment right here.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's fun to watch it now, just because as you're working on it, obviously I'd been a fan of Metal Gear ever since I was a kid playing the first one. But it doesn't really hit when you're working on it and you release it, like, oh, this is going to be super cool, but you're so deep into it. But watching it now, now's the time that I'm getting the goosebumps. I mean, like, yeah, that's a badass show off. Because, it's been a while, and it's great to see.
Okay, let's keep going. I do have some questions too about sound. I know you didn't do sound effects and VO dialogue necessarily for this title, but you learned a lot, I imagine, over the years since, about Kojima's preferences on other titles. I find, like, in these games, he's very the atmospheric sounds play a big role. Like thunder, rain, weather, ambience, sort of like playing almost like a part of the orchestra. Like it's got emotional undertones. Like what sorts of preferences have you learned about what he's looking for in scenes like this?
Well, there's a lot of rain in this scene. There's a lot of rain in other games that I've worked on with him, and it's always a very hard thing to balance with especially the type of non-traditional music that we've been doing together with Mr. Kojima for the duration that I've been working with him, and he does prefer to be able to point out things that are minute details that usually you'd be like, do we actually need the sound for that? But like the flapping of the tarp, for example. So I think in general, he loves super detailed things, and the real storytelling then comes in the mix, I think, when we have all those details and we're choosing what to focus on and balancing everything in between. The non-traditional type of ambient music, that I think, if anything, the reason that it works so well is just because the music isn't trying to be too much music all the time, and can then sort of integrate better with all these sound effects, especially with white noisy stuff like rain. You can sort of lean into the lower end stuff on the music side and just create a mood without even adding a melody or anything. Mm-hmm. That's something that I feel like we tried to lean into with this one, especially in the beginning here, for example.
In the years after this title, as you built on your working relationship and other titles together, like what was your approach to Foley on other games? Like, do you outsource to a specific team somewhere, or like, how did you all go about covering Foley for Kojima titles after this?
So it's actually an interesting thing about Foley. Mr. Kojima loves Foley. He loves filmmaking, so he was adamant about having Foley done properly as the first person in video games in Japan at the very least. The lead sound designer, I think the title that we have in the trailer here, Teruta-san, was hired on a bunch of years before I came on, but specifically to create a Foley studio within Konami. He'd previously done Foley for films. So they built a smaller, but still a proper Foley studio at Konami at the offices. And I think he did most of at least the walkies and stuff like that. They also outsourced somewhere for this title. Beyond that, when working at post Konami Kojima Productions, we were obviously working with PlayStation, and they have their own big audio team and Foley stage. So I was thankfully able to go out to San Diego, where they have their studios a bunch of times, and work with the members of the team and talk about the approaches to the detailed sounds that we'd either be doing Foley or other approaches to sound design for. But again, Mr. Kojima's always been a big fan of the idea of Foley in general, I think.
That's incredible. I had no idea you all built an internal team at Konami for that. And then, I know Joanna and team do incredible work at PlayStation in their growing Foley department. They always do incredible work.
Absolutely. Yeah. They just finished their new campus right after Death Stranding was done. Oh. So unfortunately, we did not get to work within those facilities, but they still had amazing facilities that that we used to mix and create the sound design for down in San Diego.
Mm-hmm. Also love to hear about, you obviously, your relationship with Kojima and company grew over many titles and years after this. And you mentioned that he obviously loves details, which comes through very clearly in a cinematic like this. But on top of just like naturalism, like, realistic details, I think one thing that's great about all of his work, including this, is there's a sort of like stylization, like a flair on top of what's realistic, what's natural, like almost like a heightened version of reality, like a stylized cinematic version of sounds. Like on titles after this, how did you go about sort of like sweetening sounds to sound more impactful on top of just like realistic, more natural sounds?
I think that comes down to every sound by itself almost. I'm not specifically trained in sound design, so I work a lot off of emotion and just taste, I guess. So for me, it's like when I hear something and I feel like it's missing something, I try to come up with a way of explaining how I feel that might not be as, technically proficient as somebody who's been doing it for years and years and years and, mained in that direction. But usually my go-to is sort of trying to come up with a concept that makes it make sense. I think one of the more interesting things that we did for Death Stranding, for example, is that we went out to the Salton Sea out in, by San Diego, and we grabbed all these, the sand by the Salton Sea, since that is basically a dead lake, it's super acidus. The sand is pretty much 90% made out of fish bones. So we grabbed a bunch of that sand and we wanted to use that for the Foley, for the footsteps on what we call the beach, which is the world of the dead in Death Stranding. So I feel like sometimes the emotional connection to a sound can be enforced by a conceptual idea that might just give it something special. Otherwise, it might also be a good way of making people excited about what you're creating. But I think it really just comes down to, and I'd have to come up with other examples to give other directions or ideas of how I would approach that. But I think a lot of the stuff, especially in Metal Gear, that Mr. Kojima did with the sound design team was, again, conceptual ideas of utilizing sounds that aren't necessarily directly connected to what they're supposed to be in the game. Like the sounds of the Walkman thing that you have are definitely not super futuristic, even though it looks super futuristic. It's based on and again, I don't know exactly what they were using, but a lot of that stuff is just conceptual ideas. I think one of the things we did in Death Stranding was you have this pod with a baby in it, and when you connect that, I wanted sort of a connection sound that would be interesting. So I thought, let's use a modern dial-up sound, like you're connecting to the internet or something in a way. So that sort of just gave us a flair to that sound design, and I generally been feeling like Mr. Kojima loves those ideas, and that's sort of building upon that creates a world of sound design and audio approach that is very much his games in a way.
Let's pause it there. This is exactly kind of what you were talking about too with the walkie moment.
Yeah.
I think there's so many interesting moments like what you're talking about. I also wanted to ask about, I know like in the Metal Gear Solid games in particular, military sounds and visuals are such an important component to grounding them in a sense of reality. And I know he and his team have done a lot of research on military. What does that look like on the sound side of things? Like what sorts of methods do you go about like recording or editing sounds to make sure that military sounds like weapons, gear, all that kind of stuff sounds accurate in a game like this?
Yeah, so I think Mr. Kojima's love of authenticity is really, palpable, and you can definitely tell. I fortunately did not have the chance to, but ever since Metal Gear Solid 3, I think they started doing these sessions with a survival coach / National Guard guy, I think, that, even the sound team members would go for excursions and learn stuff from this guy. And I think that's also sort of the base of where you see the fighting style from Metal Gear games sort of developed. Again, I did not meet the guy ever, but they'd been doing that for years and years. Interestingly enough, all of the gun sounds for Metal Gear Solid 5 were all edited from existing recordings and worked on for years and years and years. They did not record any bespoke gun sounds for that game. We did record some gun stuff for Death Stranding, which was my first opportunity to do so. First time, maybe last time ever firing a gun myself. But the sense of authenticity that Mr. Kojima definitely tries to go for in these military situations are actually sort of derived from just a lot of iteration working with existing stuff that might be authentic as it is, but it sort of needs to be still worked to really hit where it needs to hit. I think, again, like I was not completely privy into the exact duration and process of all of that. But the jingles and the jangles, the gun foley and all of that Kojima loves. So there's a lot of it.
That's incredible. Okay, we can keep playing video. So I also wanted to ask you a couple things about dialogue preferences from Mr. Kojima on games after this when you were more in charge of that and got a sense of his style and preferences. How are the choices typically made on, in let's say a cinematic, on what dialogue to trim out or remove, or the timing of things? Like how are decisions like that made in, such an elaborate, detailed cinematic?
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting things about Metal Gear 5 in particular was, or the difference between this one and the titles beyond that, was that all of the motion capture was done in Japan. None of it was done with the voice actors. So there was a bit more freedom of changing things prior to recording, and I think by the time things were recorded, then pretty much everything was set in stone. Whereas for Death Stranding, for example, we went to LA and recorded with Norman Reedus and all the actors in person for most part. Unfortunately, for the first year or so, there was the strike going on, so we recorded some of the stuff in Japan. But once you have pretty much, like everything motion captured with the audio recorded, it's really up to Mr. Kojima and the cinematic editors to create the scene. And sometimes that means that a lot of the stuff that we recorded on the stage gets cut out. Sometimes, we want to take a scene in a certain direction, make it horror, but then that doesn't really feel right. So you might cut out a thing that would connect into something that doesn't make sense anymore, so that needs to be re-edited. When you're working in a digital world digital world of video games, you're free to change anything however you want. Of course, when we do record on the motion capture performance capture stage, we do have the virtual camera that's sort of supposed to mimic the intended camera angles and everything from the get-go, but you're free to change that however you want. So it really comes down to what I mentioned when we talked about when I started working, timing-wise I started working on this scene, is up until you get timing lock or picture lock, there's a lot of iterating going on behind the scenes with the cinematic editors and Mr. Kojima coming up with how to structure the whole thing. But thankfully, he's been doing it for a while. So I think these days, a lot of it gets done in the planning stages before we even go to the recording stage. I think some of the people at PlayStation were calling us crazy for how much material we'd be recording in a single day on stage, because everything was just so efficient. But yeah, sometimes, it happens that they re-edit something with the English dialogue, and I have to come in and say, this doesn't actually make sense in English anymore, even though the Japanese subtitles that you have sort of connect. We need to change this, and then, it'll be a case of doing some ADR to restructure the language to make more sense.
I think it's also incredible. A lot of people here probably are used to the game cinematics nowadays on many games being structured around English as the first language that motion capture and everything is centered around. But on all these games up through, I guess, the Phantom Pain, it seems like everything was geared around Japanese first, and then the English chased that. And it sounds like you, luckily, are fluent in both languages. But did that present any challenges? Did you notice on Phantom Pain that was any more challenging than Death Stranding, with Japanese being the first language that's sort of the anchor for everything, and then the English and other languages chase that as opposed to the opposite?
Yeah, I think that was part of sort of why I started working with the voiceover team, is to sort of help facilitate a recording space where we could tackle some of these language barrier issues, sort of as a glorified translator in a way, coming in and giving my feedback on how the lines are read, but also making sure that it made sense going from the original script into the English. But as you're saying, yes, this, I think up until this title, everything was pretty much based on the Japanese, and then the English was derived from that after post recording the original motion capture and Japanese lines. Whereas, yeah, Death Stranding was, the script is always written in Japanese first, but you know the recordings were taken were done with the proper translation and everything in place. That still doesn't mean that we don't change things on the fly on the recording stage or in the VO booth, because sometimes the translation doesn't take into account things that happened in the previous game or stuff that, you know, you had been there to know, kind of things. So that always happens, but that has always been a real important thing of my job during the VO recordings, is making sure that the original intention comes through in the translated version of what Mr. Kojima originally thought of in Japanese.
I think another thing that's really interesting about the evolution of cinematics and with Kojima games in particular is the fidelity, like how high quality the dialogue sounds in these games. And I think like really kind of started with Metal Gear Solid 1 being so high fidelity and sounding like a film. And the entire industry kind of chased that and what your team did in the years prior to you even joining. But what did you kind of learn about Morioka-san and Kojima's preferences for dialogue cleanup? Like, is it a pretty aggressive sort of like take out every single click, every mouth lip flap kind of sound? And like what was like the EQ process? Like, I'm curious what their preferences tended to be and what you learned about that as you got more into the fold after this title.
Yeah, so it would have to be after this title. I remember who the dialogue editor at Konami was, and she was a busy person, I can tell you that much. But I did not really have a lot of look into exactly what the process was there, or the back and forth between her, Muraoka-san, and Mr. Kojima. But working on titles beyond that, work directly with the PlayStation dialogue editing team, who most of them were also part of the recording process. So they'd be there and you know, make notes of everything, small detail things that like I wouldn't be able to hear during the recordings. And like sometimes, you know, you'd have to redo a line just because of a mouth noise or something like that. But they are also magicians when it comes to that whole process of cleaning up the audio. I've learned a lot about the different types of magic that you can impose on dialogue to make it, you know, sound better, but also stuff like making it punch through. When I worked on a film here in Japan that had an opening sequence with very loud music that we had to have be loud, but we also needed dialogue to punch through. And, you know, all the things that you can do with editing transients and stuff like that, and just make it still super loud, but everything is audible, is really something that I think is incredible that the dialogue editors these days do. But, you know, sometimes, you know, you end up with something where it's like, yeah, we have to re-record this because you're recording on the stage and it's, you know, very silent to yourself type of line. And there, you know, it's just a tiny bit of noise, but it was a great take, so we're gonna do it afterwards. You know, like sometimes there's always going to be the additional VO sessions, ADR sessions to clean that stuff up, which is obviously the case for other medias other than games, film and you know, TV.
Another thing is on the sound design side of things that, you know, is I think pretty obvious in Kojima's cinematics and work. There are a lot of them here are these sort of like cinematic whooshes, like big aggressive sort of like wind buys or, you know, whooshes, cinematic kind of like big transitional sounds that, you know, as the camera's passing by the rocks on the cliff, things like that. What sort of like variety, like how many options do you need to sort of create for something like that for a game in order to be able to cover all your bases for the amount of whooshes needed for a cinematic, and Kojima and team's preferences on successive titles after this?
So I think it was definitely an artistic choice for MGS5 in particular, that they would do a lot of these sort of going in tandem with the lens flares and stuff like that. This sort of a bit over the top sort of audio language when it came to these, non-existent audio cues. This sound doesn't happen in the real world type of things. I think in titles beyond MGS5, I've leaned into doing a lot of that language within the music as well. So I don't think we did as much of it, at least for Death Stranding, where the idea was more of a complete connection between the music and the otherwise oral experience in general. So as far as I can remember, yeah, it's definitely, there's some artistic difference between those titles in terms of direction for these types of sounds.
And after this, we talked a little bit about the cinematics you'd get for a full game that aren't necessarily trailers when you get a lot more of them at once. Like, how long would you get for like a regular cinematic for a Kojima title? If you were to say get 10 cinematics at once and you're starting to near the deadline of the game, like how long would you get on a typical cinematic that's not maybe this long or this big of a marketing piece on the later titles?
Well, the thing is, you don't have certain amount of time per cinematic. You have the amount of time you have for the entire project, and you sort of have to make sure that once the scenes drop, how much that entire drop is going to push you in or out of the general schedule. I think the big difference is between the cutscenes and the trailers. That's when we're talking about really spending a different amount of time on something and just polishing and polishing and polishing. For trailers, it's that's marketing. It's gotta sell the thing. So sometimes we even throw in a couple of lies in there. There might be stuff that's not gonna be both in the audio mix and also not going to be in the actual game. Sometimes Mr. Kojima likes to throw curveballs where he presents something that is actually not part of, I wouldn't say not part of the story, but it's supposed to be misleading you. And that will also sometimes have to be part of a mix. But that's, again, trailer specific. When it comes to a general cutscene, like PlayStation's audio team, when we were working on this sound design for a certain scene, they have a general amount of minutes per week that they can churn out in terms of foley and sound design, and then there's the final mix takes. So I think like for that's the only number that I actually can remember at the minute. I think we said that we'd be getting through 15 minutes of mixing for general cutscenes, towards the end of finalizing mixes. On the music side, I always try to err on the side of caution by saying like, well, the general average, industry average for films and media is composing about a minute of music a day. That leaves a bit of leeway to get stuff done when you're really busy, but it is a company producing a product, so you need to make sure that the scheduling is based on actual numbers that you're then thinking about throughout the entire project. So even though sometimes things are not coming in on time, you're always sort of working against the whole picture.
I think it would also be really insightful to hear about the size of a team and the roles of each person on the team for a cinematic like this. So like by the time, let's say that you got to Death Stranding, you're working on a big cinematic that's going to be in a trailer, and it's going to be like a premiere cinematic for the game that's going to help drive people to want to play it. how big is the overall sound and music team for a cinematic like that, and what are the sort of like role breakdowns for it?
In general, it's always, the same amount of people, whatever you're working on, give or take. But if it's in-game or cinematics, obviously cinematics is a slightly different beast. But, you have your Foley artist, whoever's recording the Foley artist. You have a video editing, re-recording person doing sound design. And that person might also be the person who's with me in the final mix of things. And then there might be an additional sound designer on it. And depending on if you're using sounds that are already used in the game, you might want to work with the person who designed those sounds. Then for the music team, there's obviously me. There's the producers. I guess we got to mention those. There's the orchestrator, there's the recording engineers for when we're out recording, there's the players, there's the mixing engineer for the music, and then at the final end, there's me and whoever is in the mix booth mixing the final cinematics, which is usually should be pretty much just a case of balancing the different elements of dialogue, music, ambient sounds, specific sound design, and any other things that you might add. And we do that, and then we go and review with Mr. Kojima. Obviously, that is being done after having shown a rough version of the things that we're not, coming in with something that's completely off from what he'd imagined.
Mm-hmm. Let's pause it here. Last question for you, Ludvig, and you've been so generous with your time and such, insightful answers. I really appreciate all of this great information. I think you came into the fold at a really interesting time in the Metal Gear Solid sort of process, and the teams were going through an interesting period of transition. You were on, it seems like, while Harry Gregson Williams was still composing music for some of these games. Morioka-san was still working on the audio direction side, and then you kind of ended up carrying the baton after that in a really important way. What, coming away from all of that and being able to take the reins after this title, looking back on this cinematic, what was there one thing that you're most proud of and are so glad is done the way that it is, and in your contributions on this cinematic?
I have to go back to that stinger again. I mean, that's really what solidified my position as a part of the team, and where I gained trust to from there on, sort of be able to, generally speaking, talk with Mr. Kojima and be myself and not just, sit in my booth and create stuff, send it off to somebody to review, and then they send it off to somebody else, and really just grow from there. Really gave me that opportunity, and it is the standout moment for music in this trailer. So, it's definitely, again, really fortunate that it was sort of the first thing that I got to do after joining the team. And I think it just that thing that it clicked was the initial spark that led to what ended up being, me taking the reins over the final production of Metal Gear, and then, becoming the audio director at Kojima Productions and doing Death Stranding. And in a way, that's also sort of because of all that. That's why I'm still able to work on things with Mr. Kojima doing Death Stranding 2 right now. So it really was sort of a simple one click that happened there, I think.
It's incredible. Well, I want to thank you, Ludvig. This was so insightful. And I also want to thank you just for your contributions to game cinematics in general. This is so inspiring, and it's just such high level work. I don't even think this is just an in-game sort of piece of media. This to me is a piece of art. This is so beautifully done and just detailed and crafted so well. And the music is very important to the storytelling of this, and really, as a fan, just got me so excited back when it was released, and I love going through this with you and learning about how it was made. So thank you so much for your time and your contributions to all this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Eric. It's been great.
All right, everyone. Well, thank you for tuning in to this episode of MPSC Presents Designing the Game Cinematic, Metal Gear Solid V Ground Zeroes. We will talk with you next time.